Sometimes, the most broken among us are the ones with the biggest hearts to give. An old Apache warrior named Tahoma sits alone under the harsh midday sun, carrying the weight of a lifetime's worth of battles and losses. He has retreated from a world that no longer wants him, speaking little and expecting nothing but solitude in his final years. Then, one blazing afternoon, a desperate boy appears dragging a wounded donkey, tears streaming down his face as he begs for help. Though Tahoma says nothing at first, something deep inside him awakens. What begins as caring for a hurt animal becomes something much more profound. The warrior finds himself healing not just the donkey, but the boy's broken spirit and his own forgotten capacity for love. Together, they discover that redemption can come when you least expect it. But can two damaged souls truly save each other in an unforgiving world? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona territory stretched endless and unforgiving under the blazing afternoon sun. Its red earth baked hard as pottery and scarred by arroyos that told stories of flash floods and drought. In this harsh landscape, where most men measured their lives in seasons of survival, Tahoma had found his exile. His camp sat in the shadow of weathered sandstone cliffs, a deliberate choice that spoke to both his tactical mind and his desire for solitude. 3 miles from the dying trading post of Mineral Springs, far enough to avoid the curious stares and whispered conversations that followed him like dust devils, yet close enough to trade jerky and medicinal herbs for the few supplies he couldn't make or find himself. At 62, Tahoma moved with the careful grace of a man who had learned to read danger in the wind's direction and survival in the flight patterns of ravens. His face, carved by decades of sun and sorrow, bore the deep lines of a man who had seen too much and spoken too little about it. Gray streaked his long black hair, which he still wore in the traditional manner, despite having no tribe left to honor. His clothes were a mixture of old ways and new necessities: buckskin leggings beneath canvas pants, a cotton shirt over a medicine pouch that hung close to his heart. That medicine pouch, worn smooth by his fingers over countless worried nights, contained the last remnants of his people's wisdom: sacred herbs gathered from mountains now claimed by mining companies, stones blessed by medicine men whose voices had been silenced by cavalry sabers, and a small piece of turquoise that his grandmother had pressed into his palm the day before she died on the long walk to the reservation. He had carried these treasures through battles and betrayals, through choices that had saved his body while damning his spirit. The trading post itself was a monument to the dying frontier. Samuel Brookhaven, a weathered man in his 50s with kind eyes and careful hands, had run the establishment for 15 years, watching it slowly empty as the railroad pushed commerce toward larger towns. His wife Martha had died 3 winters back from the consumption, leaving him alone with shelves that grew barer each month and the loneliness that echoed in every creaking board. Samuel was one of the few white men who treated Tahoma with genuine respect, never asking questions about his past or making the subtle demands for gratitude that other settlers seemed to expect. Their transactions were conducted in careful English peppered with the few Apache words Samuel had learned, mostly relating to weather, trade goods, and the polite acknowledgments that kept their relationship cordial without becoming intimate. "Heat's building," Samuel had said that morning when Tahoma brought in a bundle of willow bark and sage. The older man's joints ached before weather changes, a gift from years of hard labor that made him as reliable as any barometer. Tahoma had nodded, pocketing the coins for his herbs and accepting the small sack of cornmeal Samuel offered in addition. It was charity disguised as commerce, and both men understood the dance well enough to preserve each other's dignity. "Boy came through yesterday," Samuel had added as Tahoma reached the door. "Young one, maybe 10 or 11. Had a donkey with him, pretty beat up. Both of them looked like they'd been traveling hard. The words had followed Tahoma back to his camp like a persistent echo. Boys alone on the frontier rarely lasted long. The land was too harsh, the distances too great, the dangers too numerous for children to survive without protection. Yet something in Samuel's tone suggested this particular boy had been different. Not just another runaway or orphan stumbling toward inevitable tragedy. Now, as Tahoma prepared his midday meal over a small fire built in a ring of stones blackened by countless previous flames, he found himself scanning the horizon more frequently than usual. The heat Samuel had predicted was building relentlessly. The kind of punishing sun that could kill a man in hours if he lacked water or shade. A dangerous time for anyone to be traveling in the open. He had learned to read the desert the way other men read newspapers, for information about what was coming and how to prepare for it. This heat would be fierce and sustained, the kind that turned the landscape into a furnace and made every breath feel like swallowing fire. A deadly afternoon for anyone caught without shelter. The boy appeared as if summoned by Tahoma's thoughts, emerging from the shimmering heat waves like a mirage that refused to dissolve. At first, he was just a distant figure moving slowly across the hardpan, barely distinguishable from the rocks and scrub brush. But as he drew closer, the details resolved into heartbreak. The child couldn't have been more than 11 years old. His clothes torn and stained with travel, his face streaked with dust and tears. He moved with the careful gait of someone nursing injuries, favoring his left leg and stopping frequently to rest. Behind him, connected by a frayed rope halter, a small donkey struggled to keep pace. The animal's coat was matted with dried blood and dirt, one of its front legs swollen to nearly twice its normal size. In the boy's free hand, Tahoma could see a small wooden cross, worn smooth by anxious fingers. The child clutched it like an anchor in a storm, the way drowning men grip driftwood. Even from a distance, the warrior could sense the depth of the boy's desperation. It rolled off him in waves, as palpable as the heat shimmer rising from the baked earth. Tahoma remained seated by his fire, his weathered hand steady as he stirred. A pot of rabbit stew. 40 years of survival had taught him the value of appearing unthreatening, of letting others make the first move. The boy would either approach or he wouldn't. Either way, the choice would be his. But something in the child's bearing, in the way he held himself, despite obvious exhaustion and pain, stirred memories that Tahoma had spent years trying to bury. There had been another boy once long ago who had looked at him with similar desperation. His own son, standing in the doorway of their wickiup as cavalry troops surrounded their camp, trusting his father to make everything right. Tahoma had failed that boy, just as he had failed his wife and daughter and everyone else who had depended on him. The guilt of those failures had driven him to this exile, to this careful life of solitude where he could hurt no one but himself. The child stopped at the edge of the firelight's small circle of shade, perhaps 20 feet away, close enough to speak, but far enough to run if necessary. The donkey stood beside him on trembling legs, its large brown eyes reflecting the harsh sunlight with a dull sheen that spoke of fever and infection. For a long moment, neither spoke. The boy studied Tahoma's face with the intensity of someone trying to read a language he didn't fully understand. The warrior continued stirring his stew, giving the child time to find his courage or change his mind. Finally, the boy's voice cut through the blazing afternoon air, high and thin but steady with the kind of determination that comes from having no alternatives left. "Can you save my donkey, please?" The words hung in the superheated air between them like smoke from the fire, carrying weight far beyond their simple meaning. This wasn't just a request for veterinary aid. It was a plea from one broken soul to another, a desperate gamble that kindness might still exist in a world that had shown the boy little but cruelty. Tahoma said nothing, but something deep in his chest A part of his heart he had thought permanently frozen began to crack like ice in spring thaw. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope, each second adding weight to the boy's desperate question under the relentless afternoon sun. Tahoma's dark eyes moved from the child's tear-streaked face to the wounded donkey, taking in details, with the practiced assessment of someone who had tended both animals and men in the field of battle. The donkey's injury was severe, a deep gash along the foreleg that had become infected. The flesh around it swollen and hot with fever. Left untreated, the animal would be dead within days, perhaps hours. But it was treatable if one knew the old ways of cleaning wounds and drawing out poison. More concerning was the boy himself. Beneath the dirt and exhaustion, Tahoma could see signs of recent trauma. The child's left shoulder sat higher than his right, suggesting an injury that hadn't healed properly. His clothes, though travel-stained, had once been well-made, the kind of family with means would provide. Yet here he was, alone in the desert with a dying animal and desperation in his eyes. "What's your name, boy?" Tahoma's voice, unused to conversation, came out rougher than he intended. The child straightened slightly, as if remembering lessons, in manners taught by someone who was no longer there to enforce them. "Tommy, sir. Tommy Morrison. And this is Rosie." He gestured to the donkey with the tenderness of someone introducing a beloved family member. Tommy Morrison. The name stirred. No recognition in Tahoma's memory, but the boy's accent carried the soft vowels of Texas Hill Country. A long way from home, assuming he still had one. "Where's your family, Tommy Morrison?" The boy's face crumpled briefly before he mastered himself, clutching the wooden cross tighter. "They're gone, sir, all gone." The words carried the flat finality of truth too heavy for a child to bear. Tahoma had heard that tone before, in the voices of Apache children whose families had been scattered to the winds by cavalry raids and government relocations. It was the sound of a soul learning to carry adult grief in a young heart. The blazing sun overhead showed no mercy, and Tahoma could see that both boy and donkey were suffering from heat exhaustion as well as their other injuries. The child's lips were cracked from dehydration. His skin had the grayish pallor of someone running on reserves, long since exhausted. Tahoma made his decision with the swift calculation of a man accustomed to life or death choices, standing slowly to avoid startling either the boy or the injured animal. He walked to where Tommy waited with the donkey. Up close, the child's condition was even more alarming. His breathing was shallow and rapid, his eyes slightly unfocused from the heat and dehydration. "Sun's getting dangerous," Tahoma said, kneeling beside the donkey to examine its wound more closely. "Need to get you both to shade and water." Tommy's relief was so profound that his knees buckled, and Tahoma caught his arm to steady him. The boy's skin burned with fever, another detail that hadn't been visible from a distance. Whatever had happened to his family, Tommy had been carrying its weight for some time, pushing himself and his animal companion far beyond safe limits in the punishing heat. "Thank you," Tommy whispered, and in those two words, Tahoma heard echoes of prayers and desperate hopes. "I prayed someone would help us. Mama always said God puts people in our path when we need them most." The mention of prayer and divine providence sat uneasily with Tahoma. He had given up on such notions long ago, when his own prayers had gone unanswered and his faith had died alongside his family. But he said nothing, focusing instead on the practical matter of getting them all to shelter before the heat became fatal. His camp consisted of a lean-to built against the cliff face, reinforced with stones and covered with canvas salvaged from an abandoned wagon. It wasn't large, but it provided blessed shade and contained his medical supplies, herbs, clean cloth, and the tools he would need to treat both the donkey's wound and whatever injuries the boy was hiding. As they made their way to the shelter, Tommy leading Rosie with infinite gentleness, despite his own obvious suffering, the boy began to speak in the halting way of someone unburdening himself of a story too heavy to carry alone. We lived on a ranch about 100 miles south of San Antonio, he said, his voice barely audible above the desert wind. Papa raised cattle and horses. Mama kept a garden and taught school to the children from neighboring ranches. We weren't rich, but we had enough. Tahoma helped him guide the donkey under the lean-to's protection, noting how the animal trusted Tommy completely despite its pain. That level of bond spoke to months or years of gentle care, the kind of relationship that developed between a child and a beloved pet. What happened? Tahoma asked as he began gathering supplies to treat Rosie's wound. Tommy's hand went to the wooden cross again, and Tahoma realized it wasn't just a religious symbol. It was a talisman, a physical connection to whatever safety and love the boy had known before his world collapsed. Soldiers came, Tommy said, the words emerging like drops of blood from a wound. Not regular army or regular cavalry, they called themselves. Said they were hunting Apache raiders who had been stealing cattle. Tahoma's hand stilled for a moment. He knew about irregular cavalry units, had encountered them during his years as an army scout. They were often little better than sanctioned bandits, using the excuse of Indian fighting to settle personal grudges and line their own pockets. They said our ranch was being used as a hideout, Tommy continued, his voice growing stronger as the story poured out of him. Said Papa was harboring hostiles and selling them weapons. Papa tried to explain that we'd never seen any Apaches, that we were loyal Americans. But they wouldn't listen. The heat was becoming unbearable even in the shade, and Tahoma worked quickly to provide water and begin treating both Tommy's dehydration and Rosie's infected wound. As he worked, Tommy pulled something from his shirt pocket with trembling fingers, a torn piece of paper. They gave Papa this, Tommy said, handing over the document. Said it was evidence of his crimes. Tahoma took the paper, studying it in the harsh light filtering through the canvas. It was a military commission, signed by a Colonel Marcus Webb, and authorizing the confiscation of property and assets from known collaborators with hostile Indian elements. The language was official enough to fool most frontier families, but Tahoma recognized it as a forgery. The seal was wrong. The signatures didn't match any officers he knew, and the legal justification was nonsense. But to a rancher like Tommy's father, faced with armed men in cavalry uniforms under the blazing sun, it would have seemed authentic enough, especially when refusing to comply would have meant immediate violence against his family. They took everything, Tommy whispered. The cattle, the horses, even Mama's jewelry that belonged to her grandmother. Papa tried to stop them when they went into the house, and his voice broke completely. Tahoma folded the forged document and tucked it into his own shirt. Evidence, perhaps, though of crimes that would never see justice in any court that mattered. How did you get away? He asked gently. Papa told me to run when the shooting started. Take Rosie and ride to Uncle Samuel in El Paso. But Rosie got hurt when we were crossing the river, and I got lost. Tommy's shoulders shook with suppressed sobs. I've been walking for weeks, trying to find the way. We ran out of food days ago. I thought we were going to die out here in this heat. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the canvas roof, turning their shelter into an oven. Tahoma began the careful work of cleaning Rosie's infected wound, his hands steady despite the emotional turmoil Tommy's story had awakened. As he worked, memories surfaced, his own family's destruction, his own desperate flight, his own years of carrying survivor's guilt like a stone in his chest. But for the first time in decades, those memories didn't paralyze him with despair. Instead, they sharpened his resolve. He couldn't undo the past, couldn't bring back his wife and children, or Tommy's parents. But he could save this boy and his donkey. He could offer shelter from the heat, healing for their wounds, and perhaps, if he was very careful, hope for whatever came next. As the sun reached its brutal peak and the temperature climbed toward deadly levels, Tahoma worked through the hottest part of the day, applying poultices to draw out infection and speaking soft words of comfort to both the boy and his animal companion. For the first time in 20 years, he had a purpose beyond mere survival. Dawn broke clear and cool over the desert, offering blessed relief from the previous day's punishing heat. Tommy woke slowly, his body finally allowing itself to rest after weeks of constant vigilance under the relentless sun. The fever that had burned through him during the scorching afternoon had broken, leaving him weak but clear-headed for the first time since he'd begun his desperate journey. Beside him, Rosie lay with her injured leg extended, the swelling noticeably reduced. Tahoma knelt next to the donkey, replacing the poultice with fresh herbs and clean cloth. His movements were economical and sure, the product of decades spent tending wounds in circumstances far more primitive than this well-appointed shelter. "She's gonna be fine," Tahoma said without looking up. "The infection is breaking. Another few days of treatment, and she'll be ready to travel again." Tommy sat up carefully, testing his own injuries. His shoulder still ached, but the constant throbbing that had plagued him for weeks had subsided to a manageable level. More importantly, the hollow desperation that had driven him across the desert was beginning to fill with something else, not hope exactly, but the possibility of hope. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice still rough from sleep and emotional exhaustion. Tahoma finished securing the bandage and moved to tend his fire, adding dried wood to coax the coals back to life. "No thanks needed. Help is freely given, or it isn't help at all." The simple wisdom of the statement struck Tommy with unexpected force. In his short life, he had learned that most people expected something in return for their kindness, gratitude, loyalty, or some future favor. But Tahoma seemed to expect nothing beyond the opportunity to ease suffering where he found it. "My mama used to say something like that," Tommy said, fingering the wooden cross that had become his constant companion. "She said kindness was like water. It had to flow freely, or it would become stagnant." Tahoma glanced at the cross, noting its rough construction and the careful way Tommy handled it. "Your father made that for you?" "Yes, sir. He carved it from a piece of mesquite wood when I was little. Said it would protect me when he couldn't be there." Tommy's voice caught slightly, but he continued, "I guess it worked, in a way. It led me to you." The warrior said nothing to this, but Tommy caught something flickering across his weathered features, pain, perhaps, or recognition of a loss that matched his own. Whatever it was passed quickly, replaced by the careful neutrality that seemed to be Tahoma's default expression. Over the next few days, as Rosie's strength returned and Tommy recovered from his ordeal, a routine developed between them. Tahoma would rise before dawn to tend the fire and check on the donkey's progress. Tommy, still weak but determined to contribute, would help with simple tasks, gathering firewood, preparing meals, keeping their camp organized. The boy proved surprisingly capable despite his youth. His parents had clearly taught him practical skills along with book learning, and he approached each task with the methodical attention to detail that spoke of good training. When Tahoma showed him how to identify edible plants and medicinal herbs, Tommy absorbed the information with the intensity of someone who understood that such knowledge might mean the difference between life and death. "This is desert sage," Tahoma said, crumbling dried leaves between his fingers to release their sharp, clean scent. "Good for cleaning wounds and reducing fever. The Apache name is ghost medicine because it drives away harmful spirits." Tommy studied the plant carefully, asking questions about how to harvest it properly and how to tell good specimens from poor ones. His curiosity reminded Tahoma of his own son, who had possessed the same eager intelligence and careful observation skills. The comparison was both painful and oddly comforting, a reminder that not all connections to the past brought only grief. On the third day, as Tommy was helping to change Rosie's bandages, he began to talk about his family again. Not the terrible end this time, but the good years before tragedy found them. "Papa was teaching me to break horses," he said, his hands gentle as he held the donkey steady for Tahoma's ministrations. Said, I had good instincts with animals. Mama wanted me to focus more on my studies. She had dreams of me going to college. Back east, maybe becoming a doctor or a lawyer. What did you want? Tahoma asked. Tommy considered this seriously, as if no one had ever asked him that particular question before. I wanted to learn everything, he said finally. Papa's way, with animals and land, Mama's way with books and ideas. I figured there was no reason I couldn't do both. The makeshift halter that connected Tommy to Rosie was a testament to that practical intelligence. Woven from scraps of rope, leather, and cloth, it had been crafted with both function and comfort in mind. Every knot was precisely placed, every piece of padding positioned to prevent chafing. It was the work of someone who understood that small details mattered when dealing with living creatures. Your father taught you to make that? Tahoma indicated the halter. Together, Tommy said, pride evident in his voice. He showed me the basic techniques, but I came up with some of the modifications. Rosie's neck is shorter than most horses, so the standard proportions didn't work right. It was a small thing, but it spoke to the kind of collaborative relationship Tommy had enjoyed with his parents, one based on mutual respect and shared learning rather than simple obedience. No wonder the boy had survived as long as he had on his own. He had been raised to think for himself while still respecting the wisdom of his elders. As the morning wore on, Tahoma found himself sharing his own knowledge more freely than he had in years. He showed Tommy how to read weather signs in the behavior of insects and birds, how to find water in the desert by following animal tracks, how to move quietly across different types of terrain. The boy absorbed it all with gratitude and intelligence, asking thoughtful questions that showed he understood not just the techniques, but the principles behind them. For his part, Tommy seemed to sense that Tahoma's teachings came from a deep well of hard-won experience. He never pressed for details about the warrior's past, content to learn what was offered without demanding explanations for how such knowledge had been acquired. But as the sun climbed higher and the heat began to build toward its daily crescendo, shadows of the outside world began to intrude on their peaceful routine. Dust on the horizon spoke of riders moving across the desert, not the casual pace of travelers, but the purposeful movement of men with urgent business. Tahoma watched the distant figures through eyes narrowed by years of survival, reading their intent in the way they sat their horses and the direction of their approach. They were still miles away, but their path would bring them close enough to the camp to pose a potential threat. We may have visitors soon, he told Tommy quietly. It would be wise to move Rosie to the hidden corral I've prepared behind the rocks. Tommy didn't question the instruction, moving immediately to comply. But as he led the donkey away from their visible camp, he looked back at Tahoma with worry in his young eyes. Are they bad men? He asked. Tahoma checked his rifle and made sure his knife was loose in its sheath. I don't know yet, he said honestly, but it's always better to be cautious until we know for certain. As Tommy disappeared behind the rocks with Rosie, Tahoma settled down to wait, his senses alert to every sound and movement in the building heat. The peaceful interlude was ending, and the harsh realities of their world were asserting themselves once again. The riders turned out to be drifters, 3 men whose weathered faces and hard eyes spoke of lives lived on the wrong side of civilization's thin line. They approached Tahoma's camp with the casual arrogance of those accustomed to taking what they wanted from those too weak to resist. Their leader, a thick-set man with graying beard and a cavalry saber hanging from his saddle, dismounted with deliberate slowness. His companions remained mounted, hands resting casually on their sidearms in a display meant to intimidate without quite crossing the line into open threat. Afternoon, friend, the leader said, his voice carrying the false hardiness of a man who had never met a stranger he couldn't rob. Name's Fletcher. These are my associates, Mills and Garrett. We're tracking some stolen horses' spotted tracks leading this way. Tahoma remained seated by his fire, his own hands visible and apparently relaxed. To the casual observer, he looked like exactly what Fletcher expected to find: an aging Indian living on the margins, vulnerable and alone. It was a useful misconception. "Haven't seen any horses," Tahoma replied truthfully. "Just passing through myself." Fletcher's eyes swept the camp, taking inventory of supplies and looking for signs of wealth worth the effort of taking. What he saw was disappointing: a few basic necessities, some dried meat, and cooking implements that had seen better years. But his gaze lingered on Tahoma's rifle, a fine Winchester that would fetch good money in the right market. "That's a nice weapon you've got there," Fletcher said, stepping closer to the fire. "Seems like more gun than a man in your position would need." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Tahoma felt the familiar calm that preceded violence, the settling of nerves and sharpening of senses that had kept him alive through dozens of similar encounters. But this time was different. This time he had someone else to protect. "A man never knows what he might need to hunt," Tahoma said quietly. From behind the rocks where Tommy waited with Rosie, there came the soft sound of a shifted stone. Fletcher's head turned toward the noise, his interest sharpening like a predator scenting prey. "You got someone back there with you?" he asked, his false friendliness dropping away entirely. "Just my pack animal," Tahoma said, rising slowly to his feet, getting restless with strangers around. Fletcher wasn't buying it. He jerked his head toward the rocks, and Mills began to dismount, clearly intending to investigate. The situation was rapidly moving beyond the point where it could be resolved with words. That was when Tommy made his choice. He emerged from behind the rocks, leading Rosie, his young face set in determined lines that reminded Tahoma powerfully of the boy's father. In his free hand, he carried a stick he had shaped into a rough walking staff, and he moved with the careful dignity of someone who refused to be intimidated despite being obviously outmatched. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Tommy said, his voice steady despite the fear Tahoma could see in his eyes. "I'm Thomas Morrison. This is my friend, Mr. Tahoma." Fletcher's expression shifted from predatory interest to calculating assessment. A boy meant potential ransom, but it also meant complications. Children have families who looked for them, who asked questions, and sometimes offered rewards for information. "Well now," Fletcher said, his false smile returning. "That's a fine animal you've got there, son. Must be worth something to the right buyer." Tommy's grip tightened on Rosie's halter, and Tahoma saw the boy's knuckles go white with tension. But when Tommy spoke, his voice remained calm. "She's not for sale. But if you gentlemen are hungry, we'd be happy to share our midday meal." It was masterfully done, an offer of hospitality that both acknowledged the stranger's presence and established Tommy as someone under Tahoma's protection. Fletcher might rob a lone Indian with impunity, but attacking a white child would bring the kind of attention that even outlaws preferred to avoid. Fletcher studied Tommy's face carefully, and Tahoma saw the moment when recognition dawned. The boy's features, his manner of speech, even his clothing all marked him as someone from a family of means, the kind of people who would be missed if they disappeared. "Morrison," Fletcher said slowly. "That name's familiar. You wouldn't be related to the rancher family that got hit by them Apache raiders a few weeks back, would you?" Tommy's composure cracked slightly, but he recovered quickly. "My family is dead," he said simply. "Mr. Tahoma has been helping me get to my uncle in El Paso." The lie was smooth and believable, casting Tahoma in the role of Good Samaritan rather than potential accomplice to whatever crimes Fletcher might be imagining. More importantly, it established Tommy's destination as somewhere specific and expected, making his disappearance a matter that would eventually be investigated. Fletcher exchanged glances with his companions, and Tahoma saw them weighing options. The boy clearly had some value, but pursuing it would mean dealing with an old Apache who might prove more dangerous than he looked. The safer play was to move on and find easier prey. "Well," Fletcher said finally, "that's a real tragedy, son. I'm sorry for your loss. But we best be moving along, still got those horse thieves to track down." He remounted with the same deliberate slowness he had used to dismount, a final display of dominance that allowed him to save face while backing down from a confrontation he no longer wanted. His companions followed suit, and within minutes they were riding away into the shimmering heat. Tahoma and Tommy stood in silence until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. Only then did Tommy's carefully maintained composure finally crumble, his knees giving way as the adrenaline drained from his system. "You did well," Tahoma said quietly, helping the boy to a seat by the fire. "That took real courage." "I was terrified," Tommy admitted, his voice shaking now that the danger had passed. "But I couldn't let them hurt you or Rosie. You saved us. It was my turn to help." Later that afternoon, as they shared a quiet meal and tended to Rosie's continued recovery, Tommy asked the question that had been building in his mind for days. "You've done this before, haven't you? Faced down dangerous men, I mean." Tahoma was quiet for so long that Tommy began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of memories that stretched back decades. "Yes," he said simply. "More times than I care to remember." Tommy waited, sensing there was more to come. After several minutes, Tahoma reached into his shirt and withdrew a small leather pouch, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. He opened it carefully, revealing an assortment of items that seemed almost random: dried herbs, small stones, a piece of turquoise, and something else that caught the afternoon light. It was a faded photograph, cracked and yellowed with age. Tahoma held it with infinite care, and Tommy could see the shapes of faces in the image, a woman and two children, posed formally but with warmth in their eyes. "My family," Tahoma said quietly. "My wife, Ayana. My son, Nalnish. My daughter, Desba." Tommy studied the photograph with respectful attention, understanding that he was being shown something precious and private. The woman was beautiful in a quiet way, with intelligent eyes and a gentle smile. The children looked to be about Tommy's age, their faces bright with the confidence of young people who believed themselves safely loved. "What happened to them?" Tommy asked softly. Tahoma's fingers traced the edge of the photograph with infinite gentleness. "They died in a cavalry raid on our village. I was away, scouting for the army. When I returned, there was nothing left but ashes and graves." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with grief that had never fully healed. Tommy understood now why Tahoma had chosen isolation, why he lived apart from both Apache and white communities. He was a man caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. "Is that why you helped me?" Tommy asked. "Because you lost your own son?" Tahoma carefully returned the photograph to its place in the medicine pouch, his movements slow and reverent. "Perhaps," he said. "Or perhaps you helped me remember that some things are worth the risk of caring about." Outside their circle of shade, the desert heat stretched endless and unforgiving, full of dangers they couldn't see or predict. But for the moment, they were safe: a damaged warrior, an orphan boy, and a healing donkey, bound together by circumstances, and choice into something that might, with time and care, become a family. 2 weeks passed in the rhythm of healing and learning. Rosie's leg had mended sufficiently for gentle exercise, and Tommy's own injuries had faded to occasional twinges. But more than physical healing had taken place in their desert sanctuary. A bond had formed between the man and boy that neither had expected when they first met across the campfire. Tahoma found himself sharing not just survival skills, but pieces of Apache wisdom that he had thought buried forever. He taught Tommy to read the stories written in animal tracks, to understand the language of birds and wind, to move through the landscape as a participant rather than an intruder. In return, Tommy brought enthusiasm and fresh perspective to knowledge that had grown stale with disuse. The Apache word for horse is bish jagai nakai, literally metal that makes noise. Tahoma explained as they watched a wild Mustang herd graze in the distance during the cooler morning hours. But we also call them companions of the wind, because they carry our spirits across the earth. Tommy absorbed this with the same careful attention he gave to all of Tahoma's teachings. "Rosie's more like a companion of my heart," he said, stroking the donkey's neck. "She's been with me through everything." It was during one of these peaceful teaching moments that the first sign of trouble appeared. Samuel Brookhaven rode into their camp at midday, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim with worry. The old trader dismounted heavily, accepting the cup of water Tahoma offered before speaking. "Bad news coming your way," Samuel said without preamble. "There's been talk in town about an Indian and a white boy traveling together. Some folks are saying the boy might be stolen goods." Tahoma felt the familiar chill of impending violence, the sensation that had saved his life countless times over the years. What kind of talk? The territorial marshal got word that Tommy here might be the Morrison boy whose family was killed. There's some question about whether Apaches were really responsible for that raid, or if it was something else entirely. Samuel glanced meaningfully at Tommy. Either way, there's a reward posted for information about the boy's whereabouts. Tommy had gone very still, his hand instinctively moving to the wooden cross at his chest. "They think Mr. Tahoma took me?" "Some do," Samuel admitted. "There's been agitation about Indians in general lately. Couple of ranches have had cattle go missing, and it's easier to blame Apaches than admit the thieves might be white men." Tahoma understood the dynamics at work. In times of uncertainty, communities often turned their fear and frustration toward convenient scapegoats. An Apache warrior traveling with a white child would be an irresistible target for that kind of displaced anger. "There's more," Samuel continued reluctantly. "That Colonel Webb, the one whose name was on those forged papers. You showed me he's been asking questions around the territory. Claims he's investigating Indian raids, but folks say he's more interested in finding people who might contradict his reports." The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Webb and his irregular cavalry unit weren't hunting Indian raiders. They were eliminating witnesses to their own crimes. The forged commission had been just the beginning of a larger scheme to steal from frontier families under the guise of military necessity. "How long do we have?" Tahoma asked. "Maybe a day or two before they organize a search party. Webb's been pushing hard for official sanction to hunt down Indian kidnappers, and the territorial governor is under pressure to do something about the supposed Apache problem." Tommy stood abruptly, his young face set in determined lines. "Then I need to turn myself in. I can tell them the truth about what really happened to my family." "No." Tahoma's voice carried absolute finality. "They won't believe you, and even if they did, it wouldn't matter. You're the only witness to what Webb did. Dead witnesses tell no tales." The harsh reality of their situation settled over the camp like the oppressive afternoon heat. Tommy was indeed stolen goods, not by Tahoma, but by circumstances that had left him with knowledge too dangerous to possess and nowhere safe to go. "There might be another way," Samuel said slowly. "I've got contacts in El Paso, people who could get the boy safely to his uncle without going through official channels. But it would mean traveling through some rough country, and you'd both be hunted men until you got there." Tahoma considered their options with the tactical mind that had kept him alive through decades of warfare. Running would mean abandoning the relative safety of their current position for the uncertainties of the trail. But staying would mean facing impossible odds when Webb's forces arrived. "What about Rosie?" Tommy asked, his practical concerns cutting through the adult's strategic planning. "She's not strong enough for hard traveling yet." It was a valid point. The donkey had recovered well, but sustained flight across desert. Terrain would strain her healing leg beyond its current limits. They needed more time they might not have. That afternoon, as they discussed their limited options around their small fire, Tahoma made a decision that surprised even himself. Reaching into his possessions, he withdrew something he hadn't touched in years, a broken arrowhead, its obsidian point shattered, but its significance intact. "This is from my last battle as an Apache warrior," he said, holding the fragment up to catch the harsh sunlight. "I broke it deliberately when I decided to put down my weapons and seek a different path." Tommy studied the broken arrowhead with respectful attention, understanding that he was being shown another piece of Tahoma's carefully guarded past. "I spent 20 years trying to forget that I was ever a fighter," Tahoma continued, "trying to convince myself that healing was enough, that I could live quietly and harm no one. But some fights choose you, whether you want them or not." "You're talking about fighting them," Tommy said. "It wasn't a question. I'm talking about protecting what matters," Tahoma corrected. "You and Rosie matter. The truth about what happened to your family matters. Sometimes a man has to decide what he's willing to risk to defend those things." Samuel shifted uncomfortably in the heat. "You're talking about going up against a cavalry unit, even an irregular one. That's not a fight you can win, Tahoma." "I've won fights with worse odds," Tahoma replied quietly. "And I have advantages they don't expect." Over the next hour, as the sun beat down mercilessly and the desert shimmered with heat waves, Tahoma outlined a plan that was equal parts desperate and brilliant. It would require precision, timing, and a return to skills he had spent decades trying to forget. But if it worked, it would not only ensure Tommy's safety, but expose Webb's crimes in a way that couldn't be ignored or covered up. "It's dangerous," he concluded. "For all of us. Samuel, you'd be risking your livelihood and possibly your life. Tommy, you'd have to trust me completely and do exactly what I say when I say it." Tommy's response was immediate and unwavering. "I trust you with my life. You've already saved it once." Samuel took longer to consider, weighing the risks against his own conscience and the friendship he had developed with both of them over the years. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I've been watching good people get trampled by men like Webb for too long," he said. "Maybe it's time to take a stand." As they began to refine the details of their plan, Tommy asked a question that had been troubling him since Samuel's arrival. "Why are you willing to help us? You barely know me, and helping an Apache could bring trouble to your business." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the wavering heat rising from the baked earth. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old regrets and hard-won wisdom, because sometimes a man gets a chance to do something that matters more than his own comfort, he said. "And if you don't take those chances when they come, you spend the rest of your life wondering what kind of person you really are." The broken arrowhead lay between them on the ground, its shattered point catching the last gleams of afternoon light. Tomorrow, Tahoma would have to become a warrior again, not for conquest or revenge, but for something more precious, the chance to protect innocence and defend truth in a world that seemed increasingly hostile to both. But today, they were still just a damaged warrior, an orphan boy, a healing donkey, and an aging trader, bound together by choice and circumstance into something that felt remarkably like family. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The next morning brought more than just the rising sun. It brought confirmation that their fears were well-founded. Samuel returned before dawn with news that chilled them all to the bone. "They found something," he said without preamble as he dismounted. His face was ashen, and his hand shook slightly as he accepted the cup of coffee Tommy offered. "About 15 miles south of here, near Willow Creek. The remains of a campsite." And he glanced at Tommy, clearly reluctant to continue. "Tell us," Tahoma said quietly. "Bodies. 3 children. Looked like they'd been there maybe a week. all of them showing signs of. Samuel stopped, unwilling to voice the full horror in front of Tommy. But Tommy's face had already gone white with understanding. They were taken, weren't they? Like the missing children you mentioned before. Seems that way, Samuel confirmed. But here's the thing, whoever did this tried to make it look like an Apache raid. Left arrows, moccasin tracks, even scattered some traditional Apache ornaments around the scene. Tahoma felt cold fury building in his chest, but the arrows were wrong, different fletching pattern than any Apache tribe uses. The moccasins had nails in the solace, white man's construction. And the ornaments were the kind you can buy in trading posts, not the real ceremonial pieces an Apache would carry. It was a crude frame job, but one that would convince most frontier settlers who wanted to believe that Indians were responsible for their fears and losses. More importantly, it provided Webb with the justification he needed to escalate his hunt. For the Apache kidnappers who had supposedly taken Tommy. There's something else, Samuel continued, reaching into his saddlebag to withdraw a small object wrapped in cloth. I found this at the scene. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a child's handmade doll, simple but lovingly crafted, with yarn hair and a dress sewn from scraps of calico. One arm had been torn away, and the fabric was stained with dirt and worse things. Tommy stared at the doll with growing horror. I know this. I've seen this before. Where? Tahoma asked, though he dreaded the answer. At the trading post. About a month ago. A little girl had it with her when her family stopped for supplies. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. Her parents were talking about heading west to California. Said they'd saved enough money to buy land near Sacramento. The implications hit them all simultaneously. This wasn't just random violence, it was a pattern. Families with resources were being targeted, robbed, and murdered, with the crimes disguised as Indian raids to deflect investigation. Tommy's family had simply been one link in a chain of atrocities that stretched across the territory. How many? Tahoma asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been asking around, real careful like, Samuel said. Could be as many as a dozen families over the past 6 months. All of them had money or valuable property. All of them killed in supposed Apache raids that left no survivors to tell what really happened. Except me, Tommy said quietly. Except you, Samuel confirmed. Which is why you can't stay here any longer. Webb's search party will be organized by tomorrow morning, and they'll come straight here based on the reports of you and Tahoma traveling together. Tahoma stood and walked to the edge of their camp, staring out across the desert landscape that had been his sanctuary for so many years. Leaving meant abandoning not just this place, but the carefully constructed life of isolation he had built here. But staying meant certain death for Tommy, and probably for himself as well. There's something you need to know, he said finally, turning back to face them. About my time as an Army scout. Tommy and Samuel waited, sensing that another piece of Tahoma's carefully guarded history was about to be revealed. I didn't just scout for the Army, Tahoma said, his voice heavy with old shame. I led them to Apache camps. I helped them plan raids against my own people. I told myself it was necessary. That cooperation was the only way to save some Apache lives in the face of inevitable defeat. The words hung in the air like a physical weight. Tommy's eyes widened with shock, but not the disgust Tahoma had expected. Instead, the boy seemed to be processing this information through the lens of his own recent experiences with impossible choices. How many? Tommy asked, unconsciously echoing Tahoma's earlier question. 7 raids over 3 years. Hundreds of people killed or displaced, including, eventually, my own family when the Army decided they no longer needed their Apache scout. Tahoma's voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly. I've been running from that guilt for 20 years. Samuel let out a long breath. Jesus, Tahoma, no wonder you've been living like a hermit. But you stopped, Tommy said suddenly. You chose differently when you saw what it was costing you. Too late to matter, Tahoma replied bitterly. Maybe not, Tommy said, his young voice carrying surprising conviction. Maybe this is your chance to use those skills for something good instead of something that haunts you. The boy's words struck Tahoma with unexpected force. Here was a child who had lost everything to violence and betrayal, yet he was offering absolution and even encouragement. It was a generosity of spirit that shamed the warrior's self-pity and challenged his assumptions about redemption. "What are you thinking?" Samuel asked, reading something in Tahoma's expression. "I'm thinking that Webb made a mistake when he tried to frame the Apache for his crimes," Tahoma said slowly. "He's counting on everyone believing that Indians are savage and unpredictable, that we strike without warning and disappear like ghosts." "That's exactly what he's counting on," Samuel agreed. "Then maybe it's time to give him what he expects," Tahoma said, a cold smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "But not in the way he's planning." Over the next few hours, as they refined their desperate plan, Tahoma found himself drawing on skills and knowledge he had hoped never to use again. But this time, instead of serving an army that saw him as expendable, he would be fighting to protect an innocent child and expose the truth about systematic murder. The plan was complex and dangerous, requiring precise timing and the cooperation of several people who had their own reasons to see Webb brought to justice. But if it worked, it would not only save Tommy's life, but provide evidence of Webb's crimes that couldn't be ignored or suppressed. "You understand," Tahoma told Tommy, as they prepared to leave their desert sanctuary. "Once we start this, there's no going back. We'll be committed to seeing it through to the end, whatever that might be." Tommy nodded solemnly, his hand moving instinctively to the wooden cross that had become his talisman. "I understand, but I also understand that sometimes running isn't enough. Sometimes you have to turn and fight, even when the odds are against you." As they loaded their few possessions and prepared Rosie for travel, Tahoma reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. A month ago, he had been a man without purpose, counting down the days until death released him from his guilt and loneliness. Now he was planning a campaign that would either vindicate his past choices or destroy him completely. But for the first time in 20 years, the prospect of death didn't frighten him. What frightened him was the possibility of failing Tommy, of proving unworthy of the trust the boy had placed in him. The broken arrowhead lay heavy in his pocket, a reminder of violence abandoned and principles betrayed. Soon, he would have to pick up weapons again, not as a tool of oppression, but as an instrument of justice. The distinction mattered more than he had ever imagined it could. As they mounted up and rode away from the camp that had sheltered there, unlikely friendship, Tahoma allowed himself one last look back at the place where he had rediscovered his capacity for love. Whatever happened next, those days of healing and teaching had been worth the risk of carrying. Now it was time to see if a broken warrior could become something more than the sum of his failures. 3 days into their journey toward El Paso, as they sheltered in a box canyon during the worst heat of the afternoon, Tommy made a discovery that changed everything they thought they knew about each other. Rosie had been favoring her right rear hoof, and while Tahoma examined it for stones or injury, Tommy was reorganizing their limited supplies. That's when he found it, a folded document that had fallen from Tahoma's saddlebag, yellowed with age and worn soft at the creases from years of handling. At first glance, it appeared to be just another military commission, similar to the forged document that had authorized the raid on his family's ranch. But as Tommy's eyes moved across the faded text, the words began to form a pattern that made his blood turn cold. Commission of Scout Services, the header read, issued to Tahoma Nonish, Apache Nation, for service with the 7th Cavalry Regiment under Colonel Marcus Webb, Territory of Arizona, 1867 to 1870. Tommy's hands began to shake as the implications sank in. This wasn't a forgery. The paper, The ink, the official seals, all spoke of authentic military documentation, which meant that Tahoma hadn't just worked for the army in some general capacity. He had worked specifically for Colonel Webb, the man who had murdered Tommy's family. "You found it." Tahoma's voice came from directly behind him, quiet and resigned. Tommy turned slowly, the document still clutched in his trembling fingers. Tahoma's face showed no surprise, only the weary acceptance of a man who had always known this moment would come. "You worked for him," Tommy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "For Webb. You were his scout." Yes. The simple admission hit Tommy like a physical blow. For weeks, he had looked up to Tahoma as a protector, a teacher, a father figure who had appeared in his darkest hour like an answer to prayer. Now he discovered that this same man had been part of the system that had destroyed his family. "Did you—" Tommy's voice cracked, and he had to start again. "Did you know what he was doing? The fake raids? The murders?" Tahoma moved slowly to sit across from Tommy, careful not to make any sudden movements that might seem threatening. His weathered face was a mask of pain and regret. "I suspected," he said finally. "The raids I guided him to were always against. Camps that had recently acquired wealth horses, cattle, sometimes even gold from prospecting. I told myself it was coincidence, that we were simply targeting the most successful Apache groups to set an example." "But you knew," Tommy pressed, anger beginning to build through his shock and betrayal. "I knew," Tahoma admitted. "And I did. Nothing to stop it because I was afraid. Afraid that if I refused to cooperate, Webb would turn his attention to my own family. I thought I could protect them by being useful to him." The bitter irony of it wasn't lost on either of them. Tahoma's attempts to protect his family through collaboration had ultimately led to their destruction when Webb decided his Apache scout had outlived his usefulness. Tommy stood abruptly, pacing to the mouth of the canyon as he struggled to process this revelation. Everything he thought he knew about Tahoma, about their relationship, about the meaning of the past few weeks, had been turned upside down. "So when you saved me," Tommy said without turning around, "was it guilt? Were you just trying to make up for what you helped him do?" "At first, perhaps," Tahoma replied honestly. "But it became something more. You became something more. How? Can I trust anything you say?" Tommy's voice was sharp with the pain of disillusionment. "How do I know this isn't just another one of Webb's plans? Maybe you're leading me into a trap right now." The accusation hung between them like a chasm that might never be bridged. Tahoma felt the weight of every choice he had made, every compromise he had accepted, every time he had chosen survival over principle. The boy's distrust was not only justified, it was probably wise. "You can't know," Tahoma said quietly. "You can only decide what you believe based on what you've seen of me these past weeks. Have I been a man who would betray a child's trust? Have my actions been those of someone who serves Webb's interests?" Tommy was quiet for a long time, staring out across the desert landscape that stretched endlessly before them under the punishing sun. When he finally spoke, his voice was older somehow, as if the last of his childhood innocence had been burned away by this revelation. "I want to believe you," he said. "But I don't know how to tell the difference between a good man who made bad choices and a bad man who's gotten better at hiding it." It was a remarkably mature insight for someone so young, and it cut Tahoma more deeply than any accusation could have, because it highlighted the central question that had tormented him for 20 years. Was redemption possible for someone who had betrayed their own people? Or was he forever defined by his worst moments? "There's something else you should know," Tahoma said, reaching into his shirt to withdraw the medicine pouch that contained his most treasured possessions. "About how my family really died." Tommy turned back to face him, sensing that another revelation was coming. Tahoma opened the pouch with careful hands and withdrew the faded photograph of his wife and children. But this time, he also pulled out something else, a military report, folded small and hidden beneath the other items. "This is the official account of the raid that killed my family," he said, offering the document to Tommy. "Read it." Tommy took the paper reluctantly, his eyes scanning the formal military language. As he read, his expression shifted from suspicion to confusion to horrified understanding. "It says here that you led the raid," Tommy said, looking up at Tahoma in shock. "Bet you guided Webb's men to your own village." "That's what the official records show," Tahoma confirmed. "Webb needed someone to blame for the massacre when his superiors began asking questions about civilian casualties. Who better than the Apache scout who had supposedly gone rogue and turned his knowledge against his former employers? The full scope of Webb's manipulation was becoming clear. He had used Tahoma's cooperation to identify and destroy Apache communities, then framed the scout for the very crimes he had ordered. It was a perfect system. The perpetrator eliminated all evidence of his methods while simultaneously removing the one person who could testify against him. "But if this is the official record," Tommy said slowly, "then as far as the army is concerned, you're a wanted criminal. You could be hanged for treason." "Yes," Tahoma said simply, "which is why I've spent 20 years in exile, afraid to trust anyone with the truth." Tommy stared at the military report, his young mind struggling to process the layers of betrayal and manipulation it represented. Finally, he looked up at Tahoma with eyes that held a new kind of understanding. "He destroyed your life just like he destroyed mine," Tommy said. "We're both victims of the same man, in different ways," Tahoma agreed. "But yes, Webb has been spreading destruction across this territory for years, using his military authority to cover his crimes and eliminate anyone who might expose him." The anger that had been building in Tommy began to shift, transforming from rage at Tahoma to fury at the system that had destroyed both their families. This wasn't a simple story of good versus evil. It was a complex web of exploitation, fear, and survival that had trapped them both. "So what do we do now?" Tommy asked. Tahoma carefully returned the documents to his medicine pouch, his movements slow and deliberate. "Now we have a choice. We can continue running, trying to stay ahead of Webb's hunters for the rest of our lives. Or we can turn and fight, not just for our own survival, but to expose the truth about what he's done. Fighting means you could be captured and executed as a traitor," Tommy pointed out. "Yes," Tahoma agreed. "But running means Webb continues to murder innocent families while the real perpetrator of these crimes goes free. It means other children will lose their parents the way you lost yours." Tommy was quiet for several minutes, weighing options that all carried terrible risks. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady with resolve. "If we're going to fight him," he said, "we need to do it smart. We need evidence that can't be ignored or suppressed. And we need allies who can't be intimidated or bought off." Tahoma felt a surge of pride at the boy's tactical thinking. Despite his youth and recent trauma, Tommy was approaching their situation with the kind of strategic mind that could make the difference between justice and martyrdom. "I have an idea about that," Tahoma said. "But it will require us to trust each other completely, despite everything you've learned about my past." Tommy met his eyes directly, and Tahoma saw in him a maturity that had been forged in fire and tempered by betrayal. "I choose to trust you," Tommy said simply. "Not because I'm sure you won't disappoint me again, but because the alternative is to give up hope entirely. And I'm not ready to do that yet." It was forgiveness offered with full knowledge of the risk it entailed, and it humbled Tahoma more than any condemnation could have. This boy had every reason to walk away, to seek safety in distance and solitude. Instead, he was choosing to stand and fight alongside a man whose past was stained with betrayal and blood. Together, they began to plan not just their escape, but their return to confront the monster who had destroyed both their lives. It would be dangerous beyond measure, But for the first time since his family's death, Tahoma felt that he was fighting for something worth the risk of everything. The evidence Tommy and Tahoma needed lay scattered across the territory in the form of grieving witnesses, official documents, and the personal effects of Webb's victims. But gathering that evidence meant traveling through hostile territory, approaching people who had every reason to fear both an Apache warrior and the white boys supposedly under his protection. Their first stop was the mission at San Miguel, where Father Francisco Delgado had been ministering to both Mexican and Anglo settlers for over a decade. The priest was a man of unimpeachable integrity, whose word carried weight with territorial authorities. If they could convince him to listen to their story, they approached the mission at dawn, when the morning light painted the adobe walls golden. Tahoma had shed his traditional clothing for a simple shirt and pants that would draw less attention, but his Apache features made disguise impossible. Father Delgado met them at the mission gates, his weathered face showing curiosity rather than fear. "I know who you are," he said to Tommy without preamble. "The Morrison boy whose family was killed. There are people looking for you." "I know, Father," Tommy replied respectfully. "That's why we're here. We need to tell someone the truth about what really happened." Over the next hour in the cool shadows of the mission chapel, they laid out their evidence. The forged documents, the details of Webb's systematic targeting of wealthy families, the inconsistencies in the supposed Apache raids that had left no survivors to contradict the official reports. Father Delgado listened without interruption, his expression growing more troubled as the scope of the deception became clear. When they finished, he sat in silence for several minutes, praying quietly in Spanish. "This is a serious accusation," he said finally. "Colonel Webb has the backing of the territorial government. To challenge him without ironclad proof would be not just dangerous but futile." "We know where to find that proof," Tahoma said. He explained their plan risky, complex, and requiring the cooperation of several people who had their own reasons to fear Webb's retribution. "You're asking me to risk everything I've built here," Father Delgado said. "This mission serves over 200 families. We're asking you to risk your mission to save the lives of families like mine who haven't been targeted yet," Tommy said quietly. The priest studied Tommy's young face, seeing in it a gravity that belonged to someone much older. After a long moment of prayer, he returned to them with his decision written in the firm set of his shoulders. "I will help you," he said. "Not because I'm certain you're right, but because I'm certain that doing nothing is wrong." Their next ally came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos had been a servant in Webb's household until her brother disappeared during one of the colonel's Indian hunting expeditions. She knew the routines of Webb's men, the layout of his compound, and most importantly, where he kept the records that would prove his systematic theft and murder. They met her at midnight in an abandoned barn outside the settlement of Dos Cruces. Maria was a woman of perhaps 30, with intelligent eyes and calloused hands that spoke of hard work and harder choices. "It can be done," she said when they finished explaining what they needed. "But Webb keeps his private papers in a safe in his study, and that room is guarded at all times." "What about during his monthly inspection tours?" Tahoma asked. "He takes most of his men with him, but the ones left behind are the most loyal." Maria paused, considering possibilities. Unless there was word of a large Apache raid building in the Northern Territories. If Webb received word of an imminent attack, he would take every available man to respond. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. They would be using the threat of an Apache raid to expose the man who had been falsely blaming Apaches for his own crimes. But it was sound strategy. How do we make sure he receives such word? Tommy asked. Tahoma smiled grimly. "Leave that to me. I still remember how to make cavalry officers believe they're facing a major Apache uprising." Over the next week, they put their plan into motion with military precision. Tahoma planted false intelligence about Apache movements, carefully crafted to reach Webb through channels that would make the information seem urgent and credible. Father Delgado provided sanctuary and helped spread word among his parishioners about the true nature of the recent Indian raids. Samuel Brookhaven used his network to gather intelligence about Webb's operations. Most importantly, Tommy spent hours with Maria, learning the layout of Webb's compound, memorizing guard rotations and escape routes. Despite his youth, his small size and quick mind made him the logical choice for infiltrating the colonel's study to photograph the incriminating documents. "You understand," Tahoma told him repeatedly. "If something goes wrong, if you're caught, I won't be able to help you immediately. You'll be on your own until we can extract you." "I understand," Tommy replied each time, his young face serious, with resolve. "But someone has to do this, and I'm the only one small enough to get through the window Maria identified." The night before their planned infiltration, as they camped in the ruins of an old Spanish fort, Tommy surprised Tahoma with a gift. It was a medicine pouch, carefully crafted from soft leather and decorated with beadwork that combined Apache patterns with Christian symbols. "I wanted you to have this," Tommy said, holding out the pouch with hands that trembled slightly. "For tomorrow. For whatever comes after." Tahoma accepted the gift with reverence, understanding that it represented far more than skilled craftwork. It was Tommy's way of saying that he saw past the guilt and shame that Tahoma carried, that he believed in the man the warrior could become. "It's beautiful," Tahoma said, his voice rough with emotion. "But why?" "Because you gave me back my faith," Tommy replied simply. "Not in God, I never lost that, but in people. In the idea that someone could care about a stranger's child enough to risk everything for him." They spent that night in preparation. Tahoma applied war paint for the first time in 20 years, not the patterns of his youth, but new designs that incorporated elements from both Apache tradition and the symbols Tommy had used in the medicine pouch. It was paint for a warrior who fought for protection rather than conquest. Tommy prepared as well, donning dark clothing and practicing the movements he would need to navigate Webb's compound. His father's knife hung at his side, both weapon and reminder of what they were fighting to protect Dodd as dawn approached. Both of them understood that their relationship had evolved far beyond the simple rescue that had brought them together. They had become family in the truest sense, not through blood or law, but through choice and shared sacrifice. "Whatever happens today," Tahoma said as they prepared to move out, "I want you to know that these weeks with you have been the best of my life since my family died." "And you've given me a father again," Tommy replied. "Whatever my real father might have thought about what we're doing, I know he would be proud that someone was willing to stand up for what's right." They embraced briefly, then separated to take their positions, each carrying a bundle of children's personal items they had collected, evidence of Webb's crimes and reminders of what they were fighting to prevent. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its complexity. Tahoma would create the diversion that would draw Webb away from the compound, using his knowledge of Apache warfare to simulate a coordinated attack. While the colonel was chasing phantoms in the desert, Tommy would infiltrate the compound, photograph the incriminating documents, and escape before the deception was discovered. If everything went perfectly, they would have the evidence they needed to expose Webb's crimes to territorial authorities who couldn't ignore or suppress it. If anything went wrong, they would likely both be dead before sunset. As Tahoma took his position on the ridge overlooking Webb's compound, he could see the colonel's men responding exactly as planned to the false intelligence about Apache movements. Within 2 hours, Webb had taken the bait completely, departing with over 2/3 of his available men and creating the opening Tommy needed. From his concealed position, Tahoma watched Tommy slip through the perimeter with Maria's guidance, moving like the ghost he had learned to become during their weeks together. As Tommy disappeared into the building, Tahoma felt the weight of every choice that had led to this moment. Now, all he could do was wait, maintain his deception, and pray that the boy he had come to love as a son would emerge safely with the evidence that could finally bring down the monster who had destroyed both their families. The war paint on his face felt like both a blessing and a burden, the weight of tradition balanced against the hope of redemption. For the first time in 20 years, Tahoma was fighting not as a tool of oppression, but as a protector of innocence. Whether he lived or died, that distinction mattered more than he had ever imagined it could. His family was killed by Apache raiders. "Are you telling me that's not true?" "We're telling you that's not the whole truth," Tommy said. "The men who killed my family were wearing cavalry uniforms and carrying forged military orders. They made it look like an Apache raid to cover their theft of our cattle and land." Over the next hour, in the cool shadows of the mission chapel, they laid out their evidence. The forged documents, the details of Webb's systematic targeting of wealthy families, the inconsistencies in the supposed Apache raids that had left no survivors to contradict the official reports. Father Delgado listened without interruption, his expression growing more troubled as the scope of the deception became clear. When they finished, he sat in silence for several minutes, praying quietly in Spanish. "This is a serious accusation," he said finally. "Colonel Webb has the backing of the territorial government. To challenge him without ironclad proof would be not just dangerous but futile." "We know," Tahoma said, "but we also know where to find that proof." He explained their plan risky, complex, and requiring the cooperation of several people who had their own reasons to fear Webb's retribution. But if it worked, it would provide evidence that even the territorial governor couldn't ignore or suppress. "You're asking me to risk everything I've built here," Father Delgado said. "This mission serves over 200 families. If Webb decides I'm a threat, he can have this place shuttered and the people scattered." "Yes," Tommy said quietly. "We're asking you to risk your mission to save the lives of families like mine who haven't been targeted yet." The priest studied Tommy's young face, seeing in it a gravity that belonged to someone much older. "And if I refuse, then we'll find another way," Tahoma said. "But it will take longer, and more innocent people will die while we're building our case." Father Delgado stood and walked to the altar, kneeling before the crucifix that dominated the small chapel. His lips moved in silent prayer as Tommy and Tahoma waited, understanding that they were asking him to choose between safety and justice. When he finally returned to them, his decision was written in the firm set of his shoulders. "I will help you," he said. "Not because I'm certain you're right, but because I'm certain that doing nothing is wrong." Their next ally came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos had been a servant in Webb's household until her brother disappeared during one of the colonel's Indian hunting expeditions. She knew the routines of Webb's men, the layout of his compound, and most importantly, where he kept the records that would prove his systematic theft and murder. They met her at midnight in an abandoned barn outside the settlement of Dos Cruces, where Samuel Brookhaven had arranged the rendezvous through carefully worded messages passed between traders and merchants. Maria was a woman of perhaps 30, with intelligent eyes and calloused hands that spoke of hard work and harder choices. She listened to their plan with the intensity of someone who had waited years for the chance to strike back at the man who had destroyed her family. "It can be done," she said when they finished explaining what they needed, "but not without great risk. Webb keeps his private papers in a safe in his study, and that room is guarded at all times." "What about during his monthly inspection tours?" Tahoma asked. Samuel mentioned that he travels to the various outposts on a regular schedule. Yes, but he takes most of his men with him. The ones left behind are the most loyal, and they know the value of what they're protecting." Maria paused, considering possibilities. "Unless ... Unless what?" Tommy prompted. There's been talk of a large Apache raid building in the Northern Territories. If Webb received word of an imminent attack, he would take every available man to respond. It would be the best chance to get into his compound with minimal opposition. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. They would be using the threat of an Apache raid to expose the man who had been falsely blaming Apaches for his own crimes. But it was sound strategy, and in their desperate situation, they couldn't afford to reject a plan based on poetic justice. "How do we make sure he receives such word?" Tommy asked. Tahoma smiled grimly, and for a moment his face carried the predatory expression of the warrior he had once been. "Leave that to me. I still remember how to make cavalry officers believe they're facing a major Apache uprising." Over the next week, they put their plan into motion with the precision of a military campaign. Tahoma used his knowledge of Army communication patterns to plant false intelligence about Apache movements, carefully crafted to reach Webb through channels that would make the information seem both urgent and credible. Father Delgado provided them with sanctuary and helped spread word among his parishioners about the true nature of the recent Indian raids. The priest's moral authority lent credibility to their claims and began to create the groundswell of community support they would need if their evidence was to have any effect. Samuel Brookhaven used his network of traders and merchants to gather intelligence about Webb's operations and to identify other potential victims who might be willing to testify if they could be assured of protection. Most importantly, Tommy spent hours with Maria, learning the layout of Webb's compound, memorizing guard rotations, and escape routes. Despite his youth, his small size and quick mind made him the logical choice for the most dangerous part of their plan, actually infiltrating the colonel's study to photograph the incriminating documents. "You understand," Tahoma told him repeatedly. "If something goes wrong, if you're caught, I won't be able to help you immediately. You'll be on your own until we can extract you." "I understand," Tommy replied each time, his young face serious with resolve. "But someone has to do this, and I'm the only one small enough to get through the window Maria identified." As the day of their operation approached, Tahoma found himself struggling with doubts that went beyond tactical concerns. He was asking, this boy, this child, who had already lost everything, to risk his life for a chance at justice that might not even succeed. Was he protecting Tommy, or was he using him just as Webb had used so many others? The night before their planned infiltration, as they camped in the ruins of an old Spanish fort that provided both concealment and a clear view of the approaches, Tommy surprised Tahoma with a gift. It was a medicine pouch, carefully crafted from soft leather and decorated with beadwork that combined Apache patterns with Christian symbols. The boy had been working on it in secret during their travels, using materials traded from sympathetic merchants and techniques Tahoma had taught him during their quiet evenings together. "I wanted you to have this," Tommy said, holding out the pouch with hands that trembled slightly. "For tomorrow. For whatever comes after." Tahoma accepted the gift with the reverence it deserved, understanding that it represented far more than skilled craftwork. It was Tommy's way of saying that he saw past the guilt and shame that Tahoma carried, that he believed in the man the warrior could become rather than being trapped by the mistakes he had made. "It's beautiful," Tahoma said, his voice rough with emotion. "But why?" "Because you gave me back my faith," Tommy replied simply. "Not in God, I never lost that. But in people, in the idea that someone could care about a stranger's child enough to risk everything for him." They spent that night in preparation that was equal parts tactical and spiritual. Tahoma applied war paint for the first time in 20 years, not the patterns of his youth, but new designs that incorporated elements from both Apache tradition and the symbols Tommy had used in the medicine pouch. It was paint for a warrior who fought for protection rather than conquest, for justice rather than revenge. Tommy prepared as well, donning dark clothing and practicing the movements he would need to navigate Webb's compound. His father's knife, the one tool he had managed to save from his family's destruction, hung at his side, both weapon and reminder of what they were fighting to protect Dot as dawn approached, bringing with it the moment when their careful planning would meet the harsh test of reality. Both of them understood that their relationship had evolved far beyond the simple rescue that had brought them together. They had become family in the truest sense, not through blood or law, but through choice and shared sacrifice. "Whatever happens today," Tahoma said as they prepared to move out, "I want you to know that these weeks with you have been the best of my life since my family died. You've given me a reason to be proud of being Apache again, proud of being a warrior again. And you've given me a father again," Tommy replied, surprising them both with the intensity of emotion in his young voice. "Whatever my real father might have thought about what we're doing, I know he would be proud that someone was willing to stand up for what's right." They embraced briefly, warrior and boy, Apache and white, two souls who had found in each other the family that circumstances had stolen from them both. Then they separated to take their positions, each carrying a bundle of children's personal items they had collected, evidence of Webb's crimes and reminders of what they were fighting to prevent. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its complexity. Tahoma would create the diversion that would draw Webb and most of his men away from the compound, using his knowledge of Apache warfare to simulate the kind of coordinated attack that would require immediate and overwhelming response. While the colonel was chasing phantoms in the desert, Tommy would infiltrate the compound with Maria's help, photograph the incriminating documents, and escape before the deception was discovered. If everything went perfectly, they would have the evidence they needed to expose Webb's crimes to territorial authorities who couldn't ignore or suppress it. If anything went wrong, they would likely both be dead before sunset. As Tahoma took his position on the ridge overlooking Webb's compound, he could see the colonel's men responding exactly as planned to the false intelligence about Apache movements. Riders were already departing in small groups, racing to take positions that would allow them to intercept what they believed was an imminent attack on nearby settlements. Webb himself emerged from his headquarters building, his uniform immaculate. Despite the early hour, even at a distance, Tahoma could see the man's arrogant confidence, the bearing of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. That was about to change. Tahoma began his deception with the subtlety that had made him valuable as a scout. Small signs that would build into overwhelming evidence of Apache presence. Smoke signals carefully positioned to suggest communication between war parties. Horse tracks laid in patterns that implied large numbers of warriors moving into position. Even the discovery of evidence that Apache scouts had been observing the compound for days. Within 2 hours, Webb had taken the bait completely. The colonel departed with over 2/3 of his available men, leaving only a skeleton guard at the compound and creating the opening Tommy needed. From his concealed position, Tahoma watched Tommy slip through the perimeter with Maria's guidance, moving like the ghost he had learned to become during their weeks together. The boy's small size and careful training allowed him to avoid the remaining guards and reach the window that would give him access to Webb's private study. As Tommy disappeared into the building, Tahoma felt the weight of every choice that had led to this moment. His failures as a scout, his years of exile, his decision to help a desperate boy with a wounded donkey, all of it had culminated in this desperate gamble for justice. Now, all he could do was wait, maintain his deception, and pray that the boy he had come to love as a son would emerge safely with the evidence that could finally bring down the monster who had destroyed both their families. The war paint on his face felt like both a blessing and a burden, the weight of tradition balanced against the hope of redemption. For the first time in 20 years, Tahoma was fighting not as a tool of oppression, but as a protector of innocence. Whether he lived or died, that distinction mattered more than he had ever imagined it could. Tommy slipped through Webb's study window with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to move like water through stone. The room was exactly as Maria had described, elegant furnishings that spoke of wealth acquired through means far beyond a colonel's regular pay. And dominating one wall, the massive safe that contained the evidence of Webb's systematic theft and murder. The combination had been the hardest piece of intelligence to acquire. Maria had risked everything to observe Webb opening the safe during her final days as his servant, memorizing the sequence of numbers that would either damn the colonel or get them all killed. Tommy's fingers trembled slightly as he turned. Dial left to 18, right to 67, left to 23, right to 41. The safe opened with a whisper of well-oiled hinges, revealing stacks of documents, ledgers, and personal effects that told the story of Webb's crimes in meticulous detail. Tommy began photographing everything with the small camera Father Delgado had provided, working quickly but carefully to ensure each image would be clear enough to serve as evidence. The ledgers were particularly damning, detailed records of stolen cattle, confiscated land, and Apache raids that coincided perfectly with the disappearances of wealthy frontier families. Webb had been methodical in his criminality, keeping records that would protect him if questions arose about his sudden accumulation of wealth. But it was the personal effects that hit Tommy the hardest. Wedding rings, family photographs, children's toys, trophies taken from the families Webb had murdered. Among them, Tommy found his mother's silver locket, the one she had worn every day since his father gave it to her on their wedding day. For a moment, grief threatened to overwhelm him. His hands shook as he held the locket, remembering his mother's gentle smile and the way she would touch it whenever she spoke of his father. But then he heard footsteps in the hallway outside, and survival instinct took over. Tommy pocketed the locket and continued photographing the documents, his movements now driven by urgency rather than careful planning. The footsteps paused outside the door, and Tommy heard the distinctive jingle of spurs that meant a guard was checking the room. The door handle turned slowly, and Tommy pressed himself against the wall beside the safe, holding his breath as a Teoliho uniformed soldier stepped into the room. The man's eyes swept the space casually, seeing nothing amiss in the shadows and lamplight. But as he turned to leave, his gaze fell on the open safe. "What the hell?" the guard began. Reaching for his sidearm, Tommy moved without thinking, launching himself at the soldier with his father's knife extended. The blade found its mark between the man's ribs, sliding in with surprising ease and cutting off his shout before it could raise an alarm. The guard collapsed with a soft grunt, his weapon clattering to the floor. Tommy knelt beside the dying man, watching the life fade from his eyes with a mixture of horror and grim satisfaction. This soldier had been part of the system that killed. His family had probably participated in the massacre himself. Yet taking a life, even in justified revenge, left Tommy feeling hollow rather than vindicated. Outside, Tahoma's deception was working perfectly. The remaining guards were focused on the perimeter, watching for Apache attackers who would never come. But Tommy knew his time was running out. Eventually, someone would notice that the guard hadn't returned from his rounds. He finished photographing the most crucial documents and closed the safe, but left it unlocked in his haste. There was no time to move the guard's body or clean up the blood that was beginning to pool on the expensive carpet. Discovery was inevitable. The only question was whether Tommy could escape before it happened. As he prepared to leave through the window, Tommy heard something that made his blood run cold, the sound of multiple horses approaching at a gallop. Through the window, he could see Webb returning with a small advance party, his face dark with the realization that he had been deceived. The colonel had figured out the deception faster than they had anticipated, probably recognizing something in the Apache sign that betrayed its artificial nature. Now he was racing back to secure his compound and protect the evidence that could destroy him. Tommy had perhaps 5 minutes before Webb reached his study and discovered the break-in. 5 minutes to escape a compound that was about to be flooded with soldiers who would shoot him on sight. 5 minutes to save not just himself, but the evidence that could finally bring justice for his family and all of Webb's other victims. He climbed through the window with the camera clutched against his chest, its precious cargo of photographs, representing the hopes of everyone who had suffered under Webb's reign of terror. As his feet touched the ground outside, Tommy could hear Webb's voice shouting orders in the courtyard, organizing his men for a systematic search of the compound. The boy who had once been helpless to save his family was now the only hope for justice. Everything depended on his ability to reach the extraction point where Tahoma waited, and he had less than half a mile of open ground to cover while avoiding patrols that knew every inch of the terrain. Tommy began to run, his father's knife still bloody in his hand and his mother's locket burning against his chest like a talisman of vengeance finally within reach. Tommy ran through the blazing desert heat like a soul pursued by demons, which in many ways he was. Behind him, Webb's compound erupted into organized chaos as soldiers discovered the break-in and began their hunt. Torches and lanterns created moving pools of light that swept across the landscape, searching for any sign of the intruder who had dared to violate their colonel's sanctuary. But Tommy had advantages his pursuers didn't expect. Weeks of training with Tahoma had taught him to move like an Apache, to use shadows and terrain to become nearly invisible. More importantly, he carried within him the desperate strength of someone fighting not just for his own life, but for justice for every family Webb had destroyed. He reached the first checkpoint, a dry stream that provided cover from the compound just as searchlights began to sweep the open ground he had crossed. From his concealed position, he could see Webb himself directing the search, his usual composed demeanor cracked by fury and fear. The colonel knew what those photographs could do to him, knew that his carefully constructed empire of theft and murder was balanced on the edge of collapse. Tommy pressed forward, following the escape route he and Tahoma had planned with painstaking care. Each landmark brought him closer to safety, but also deeper into territory that Webb's men knew better than he did. As he approached the second checkpoint, an abandoned windmill that marked the halfway point to extraction, Tommy heard the sound that chilled his blood. Tracking dogs. Webb had unleashed his hounds, and their baying carried across the desert like the voices of hell itself. Tommy had perhaps 10 minutes before the dogs reached his position. 10 minutes to cover ground that would normally take 15. Fear gave him speed, but it also threatened to make him careless as he sprinted. Past the windmill, Tommy caught a glimpse of movement in his peripheral vision. 3 soldiers had positioned themselves to intercept anyone using this exact route, demonstrating a tactical awareness that spoke to Webb's military experience. They hadn't seen Tommy yet, but they would within seconds. Instead of attempting to avoid them, Tommy made a decision that would have seemed impossible just months ago, when he was still a rancher's son with no experience of violence or death. He drew his father's knife and attacked. The first soldier died quietly, Tommy's blade finding the soft spot below his jaw with precision that spoke to weeks of desperate training. The second managed a strangled shout before Tommy's knife opened his throat, but the sound was lost in the general noise of the search. The third soldier had time to draw his weapon before Tommy reached him, but the boy's small size and unexpected ferocity allowed him to get inside the man's guard and drive the knife up under his rib cage. As the third soldier fell, Tommy felt something fundamental shift inside him. He was no longer the frightened child who had fled his burning home with a wounded donkey. He had become something harder, something shaped by loss and tempered by the need for justice. The transformation scared him, even as it made him more capable of survival. The dogs were getting closer, their baying now distinct enough to count individual animals. Tommy wiped his blade clean and continued toward the extraction point, moving with the cold efficiency of someone who had learned that sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford. He reached the final checkpoint, a ring of standing stones left by some ancient people, just as the first dog appeared on his trail. The animal was a massive bloodhound, bred for tracking and built for endurance. It caught Tommy's scent and bayed triumphantly, alerting its handlers to the quarry's location. But Tommy was no longer running. He turned to face the dog with his knife ready, understanding that this was where he would make his stand. If he could disable the lead tracker, it might buy him the time he needed to reach Tahoma. The dog charged with the single-minded fury of a predator that had cornered its prey. Tommy waited until the last possible moment, then sidestepped and brought his knife across the animal's throat, an emotion Tahoma had taught him for fighting wolves. The dog collapsed in a spreading pool of blood, its final bay cut short by Tommy's precision. More dogs were coming, along with their human handlers, but Tommy had reached the extraction point. Tahoma emerged from concealment with his rifle ready, his war-painted face grim with determination. "Did you get it?" he asked as Tommy stumbled toward him. Tommy held up the camera, its precious cargo intact despite everything he had endured. "I got it all. The ledgers, the stolen property, everything. We need to destroy him." Tahoma nodded and lifted his rifle, sighting on the approaching soldiers with the calm precision of a man who had fought more battles than he cared to remember. "Then let's finish this." The final confrontation was about to begin, and both of them understood that they were fighting not just for their own lives, but for the souls of everyone Webb had wronged. Justice had been too long delayed, but it was finally within reach. Tommy drew his father's knife one more time, the blade now stained with the blood of men who had served evil. Whatever came next, he would face it as his father's son, brave, determined, and willing to pay any price for what was right. 6 months later, Tommy sat on the porch of his small house outside El Paso, watching Rosie graze in the pasture where she had finally found the peace that had eluded them all for so long. The donkey's limp was barely noticeable now, just a slight favoring of her right leg when the weather turned cold. Like all of them, she bore scars from their journey, but she had survived and found joy again. The photographs Tommy had risked everything to obtain had done exactly what they hoped. Webb's crimes had been exposed in newspapers across the territory, creating a scandal that reached all the way to Washington. The colonel himself had died in the final confrontation at the extraction point, falling to Tahoma's rifle when he attempted to murder Tommy in cold blood. His surviving men had scattered, some fleeing to Mexico, others surrendering to territorial authorities and providing testimony in exchange for lenient sentences. But perhaps more importantly, the truth had set things right for families who had been wronged. Property stolen by Webb had been returned to rightful heirs when possible, or sold to provide compensation for survivors. The territorial government had issued formal apologies and instituted new oversight procedures to prevent similar abuses. It wasn't enough to undo the damage, but it was a beginning. Tahoma emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee, moving with the careful grace of a man whose body bore the accumulated wounds of a lifetime's worth of battles. The final confrontation with Webb had left him with a bullet scar across his ribs and a limp that matched Rosie's, but he had survived to see justice done. More importantly, he had found something he thought lost forever, a family. "Any word from Father Delgado?" Tommy asked as Tahoma settled into the chair beside him. "Letter came this morning," Tahoma replied, handing Tommy one of the cups. "The territorial governor officially pardoned me for the charges Webb fabricated. My military record has been corrected, and there's even talk of a pension for my service as a scout." Tommy smiled at the justice of it. The man who had been branded a traitor for crimes he didn't commit was finally being recognized for the service he had actually provided. It wouldn't erase the years of exile and guilt, but it acknowledged the truth that had been so long suppressed. "What about the children?" Tommy asked, referring to the dozen orphans they had rescued from a trafficking ring that Webb had been protecting in exchange for a share of the profits. Most had been placed with good families, Tahoma said. Samuel found homes for 3 of them, with traders who needed help and could provide education along with work. Father Delgado is caring for the youngest ones at the mission until permanent. Arrangements can be made. It had been one of the most satisfying discoveries in Webb's files, evidence of the trafficking operation that had been stealing children from isolated homesteads and selling them to brothels and labor camps in Mexico. Shutting down that network had saved dozens of young lives and provided closure for families who had wondered what happened to their missing children. Tommy fingered the new medicine pouch that hung around his neck, a gift from Tahoma that combined traditional Apache symbols with Christian imagery. Inside were small tokens of their journey: a piece of turquoise from Tahoma's original pouch, a fragment of wood from the cross his father had carved, and a pressed flower from his mother's garden that he had found blooming wild near their destroyed ranch. "Do you ever regret it?" Tommy asked. "Fighting instead of running? We could have just disappeared into Mexico and lived quietly." Tahoma considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Sometimes I think about how much simpler our lives would have been," he said finally. "But then I remember the families who got their stolen property back, the children who were saved from slavery, the truth that finally came to light. Some things are worth the risk." Tommy nodded, understanding that wisdom in a way that would have been impossible before their journey together. He had learned that justice wasn't something that happened automatically. It required people willing to fight for it. Even when the odds seemed impossible, a rider appeared on the horizon, approaching at an easy pace that suggested friendly intentions rather than urgent business. As the figure drew closer, Tommy recognized Maria Santos, who had become their unofficial coordinator of efforts to help Webb's victims rebuild their lives. "Good news," she called as she dismounted. "The territorial legislature just approved the compensation fund for families affected by the illegal raids. Every family that can prove they were victims will receive payment from the properties Webb confiscated." It was another step toward healing, another acknowledgement of the territory bore responsibility for the crimes committed under its authority. Tommy felt a deep satisfaction that his parents' deaths had not been in vain. Their story had helped expose a corruption that stretched far beyond their individual tragedy. As the sun set over the desert landscape that had tested them all so severely, Tommy reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of peace. He had left his family's ranch as a frightened boy with a wounded donkey, convinced that his world had ended. Now he understood that it had simply transformed, that loss could become the foundation for a different kind of family built on choice rather than blood. Tahoma had found redemption not through forgetting his past, but by using the skills it had given him to protect rather than destroy. Tommy had discovered that even the weakest could fight back against injustice if they were willing to risk everything for what was right. And Rosie, faithful Rosie, who had started it all, had taught them both that healing was possible even from the deepest wounds. "Tomorrow," Tahoma said as they prepared to go inside for supper, "Samuel wants to discuss expanding the trading routes. Says there's good money to be made, helping honest settlers establish themselves in the territory." Tommy smiled at the prospect. It would be good work, the kind that built communities rather than tearing them down. And it would keep them close to the people they had fought to protect. As they walked into the house together, Apache warrior, orphan boy, and healing donkey Tommy realized that sometimes the most broken among us really were the ones with the biggest hearts to give. Their family had been forged in loss and tempered by struggle, but it had proven stronger than either blood or law could make it. In the end, that was enough. More than enough.